Ladies and gentlemen, peace be unto you. It is your host for the OG's Perspectives podcast, GunDei. And it's been a couple of weeks since we began the episode of the podcast where the theme will be a study of the biblical text or the New Testament or the section of the Bible that is generally known as the New Testament. It is the second part of the Christian Bible, and there is a text there that was written. It's a letter, in fact, an epistle that was written by the Apostle Paul, St. Paul. And it was written to a group of people in Galatia. So it's called the Epistle of Galatians. So we began discussing, if you want to say, this text a couple of weeks ago. So the first section of what I did is I was doing a social, historical, and cultural explanation of the context, right? That gave the possibility for the creation or for the realization of this text by Paul. So in the last episode, I explained how the region that was known as Galatia and Asia Minor, which is ancient Turkey. Today it's Turkey. It's a region in Turkey, northern Turkey to be more specific, how it became known as Galatia. And I explained how also who the Galatians were, the people who inhabited that region, that geographical region in Asia Minor that would become known as Galatia, that they were, the name Galatia itself, I explained that it came from the name of a group of people that the Romans, because at that time, Rome ruled the world. So the Romans called the people that lived in the region of Galatia the Gauls, because these people, as I explained, came from a particular group of people that resided prior to them coming or migrating to Asia Minor. They ethnically, that ethnic group anyway resided, and in the region of Europe that is today known as Austria. So if you want to take a while to go back and revise that introductory episode, feel free to do so, because in fact, if you're interested in this series, you have to watch every episode, because what I'm doing, I'm not even talking about the letter yet. In fact, what I'm doing is I'm giving all the background as far as I have that I believe is important for someone who is going to study or read that text so that they can interpret it properly, right? So today what I'm going to do in this episode is I'm going to continue a little bit from where we left off last episode, because last episode I was explaining how Galatian society was structured, and I mentioned that I would be talking about a concept called manumission. So today I'm going to talk about a few concepts, maybe a couple, because there's a bunch of ideas and concepts that are in the text. Now, in your translations, the English and those of y'all who speak other languages, such as that I'm familiar with, such as French and Creole, and these most of the text, at least most of the translations that I have, and those English or French or Creole Bibles, it's not that they're bad translation for their purpose, because they are, most of these texts are translated, can I say, theologically, and they're translated with the intent to nourish, if you want to say, the reader spiritually. So a lot of them are not, in fact, true study Bibles. So they're somewhat inaccurate. By inaccurate, like I said, they're good translations, a lot of them, because they bring about some of the, if I may say, possible religious slash, I'm using these terms very loosely here, spiritual points that definitely resides in the ideas of the text. But the way the text is constructed, its linguistic structure, its historical, cultural, and philosophical culture, some of these ideas are lost in the translations, most of the translations that we currently have. So one of the reasons, so let me continue. So as such, when you're reading them, a person who does not have a background on, if you want to say, the history, the culture of the Greco-Roman world, right? And at the time of the 1st century, who doesn't know ancient Greek, or more particularly Koine Greek, I believe that there is a lot that you're missing, okay, when you're reading these texts and their current translations. There are some good translations out there, but in general, the ones that we have, I believe they're not accurate. So what I'm intending to do, with these episodes is I'm going to give you, especially for this one, I'm going to give you some key concepts, some words that represent some concepts. These concepts, obviously, they point to specific ideas, right, that Paul was using, to make his case in this letter to the Galatians, that sometimes we miss because the translators are not doing justice, if you want to say, to these ideas. So to get into it, we're going to begin. Pardon me, I'm going to look down sometimes because I had to take notes. Let us begin with, there's a term ethne. There's a word called ethne. It's a Greek word, ethne. If you're acute, you'll already get a sense, an English speaker, a French speaker, get a sense of what that word may imply. So ethne, and then there's ethnos, okay? So you'll find this word in if you want to say, the original Koine Greek version of the letter. Now, that word is the Greek word from which we get our English and French word, such as ethnicity or ethnic. Now, what it means is what it means, right? So ethnics or ethnos or ethne, from which we get ethnicity, it's basically implied, or it's giving, what it's talking about is a group of people who share generally common culture, common language, common customs, and sometimes are even related by way of their, if you want to say, genealogy, right? So maybe even genetically they're related. So the term ethnos or ethnic, or ethne, and which we translate today in English as ethnicity, this is what it implies, right? It implies a specific group of people that share a specific culture. So that term, you're going to find it a lot in the text. And as you read the text, there's a reason why Paul is talking about ethnicity. There is also, in relation to the term ethne or ethnos, another word, gens in Latin. See, here's the issue, right? If you want to say, it's not a problematic, but say, remember, the time that Paul is writing the letter, it is the world that Paul finds himself in is the Greco-Roman world. So the Greco-Roman world is, because the reason it's called, one of the reasons anyways, the Greco-Roman world, again, as I explained, I think, in the last episode, is because prior to Rome ruling and dominating the ancient world, it was Greece, right? Starting with Alexander the Great. They conquered the ancient known world, and they established, if you want to say, Greek culture, Greek language, Greek philosophy across the board. Now, when the Romans picked up, they didn't necessarily do away with that. They appropriated, and I'm using the term appropriated here without any moral valuation. I'm not saying, it's not like today when we say cultural appropriation, we usually use it negatively. I'm saying that I'm using it for what it means. It's to take on a culture, a particular culture, which is mostly or probably not your own. So the Romans, they did that. Now, whether it was good or bad, it's inconsequential to our topic of discussion right now, right? And it's inconsequential to history, in fact, to the study of history. So when the Romans took over, they appropriated a lot from the past Greek culture. As such, the New Testament now, or a lot of the texts in the New Testament, because they're written at that time, at the time of the domination of the Romans, and the Romans having established Greco-Roman culture. So they are using to communicate. The people in that world, in the first century and a little bit before, they're using Greek and Latin, right, to communicate. So the reason I'm saying this is because, you see, I went from ethne, ethnos, which is Greek, and now I'm going to talk about another word or concept, gens, right? Now, this is Latin. And gens, there's also, I guess, the plural, which is gentes. Now, pardon my pronunciation. I am not a fluent Latin or even Greek speaker, so I'll do my best. So the word gens, right, and gentes, in fact, so English, French, Spanish being Latinized languages, right? We'll find those words there, in fact. So the word gens and gentes, you see in Spanish, for example, those of you who speak Spanish, and some Spanish vernaculars, at times you'll hear a Spanish-speaking person use the word gentes, Gentes. So they'll say like, mi gente, right? So my people. So that word comes from this. And in French, for example, we have the word gens, Gens, which stems from those same Latin word, gens and gentes. So what did they mean, right? Well, I'm giving you broad definition here. So gens or gentes, it's a term that was used to signify a clan, if you want to put it, simply. So what it meant, it was a clan, okay? And you'll see why as we go on, why these terms were used and why they're important there. So that concept and idea, you're also going to find it in the letter that Paul wrote to the Galatians. So gens and gentes. Now, that word represented, or it symbolizes, or it means clan, if you want to put it simply, right? So let's say it this way. So Greco-Roman society, the Greco-Dacian world, and in general, right? In certain societies, the way it was structured, it was like this, right? So you would have a people, the people consisting of clans, and the clans consisting of families, right? So these families will form, some families will group together and form a clan, and different clans will come together, right? And these families and clans, generally, they'll share, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, common culture, common language, etc., common beliefs, and they'll come together, they'll form a people. So the word gens or gentes, I should say, represented or symbolized the clan. So and people who study in sociology, y'all have a better understanding of this than myself. So, after that, let's delve a little bit deeper into this, the social structure, okay, in the Greco-Roman world. So, so here's why this is important. Look, because in the letter, like, I don't want to tell y'all too much, okay, so not to mix y'all up. And Paul in this letter, he deals a lot with group identity. And in fact, I will say this, I'll say, whether you are a religious person, right, a Christian or not, whether you're an atheist or a believer, an agnostic, this episode, if you can garner and get some insights from it that I think are relevant to our time, because similar to the time when Paul is writing this letter, and similar to what's happening in the greater Greco-Roman world, and more specifically in Galatia or Galatia, we find ourselves in a time in the world, and more specifically the West, where society is very much, how do I say this, fragmented, right? So, when you say so the idea of identity politics, right? You have in Western societies, various groups, right? Identity groups that are vying for power and influence, right? So similar in in Galatia, that's happening too. And in fact, I would propose to you that part of the reason why Paul wrote, okay, for me not, let's say, I'm saying written loosely here. You'll find out why in later episodes, why Paul, if you want to say constructed, okay, to be a little bit more accurate, this letter, it was to deal with some identity politics, identity problems of his time, which he deemed, and in fact, were problematic. Okay, so he wanted to deal with that. Now, to continue now with words and concepts that I think are important, apart from, so I just given you two words thus far, and two concepts. There's the word or concept of ethne, ethnos, it's Greek that deals with ethnicity. There's the Latin word gens or gentis, which symbolizes or mean clan. And now I'm going to talk about how, say, in Greco-Roman society, the way people were identified, right? So they had names similar to us today, but more names had more value in the ancient world than they have today in a lot of Western countries. For me not to say, because I think, and say in the African continent and possibly even in Asia, names still hold certain values. Like people, families name give name to their children for specific reasons. So in the Greco-Roman world, or just to be specific, when this letter was written, names were very important. So we have this word nomen, in fact, from which we get the English word name, and the French word for name, nom, N-O-M. It's in fact, it's a short for nomen, N-O-M-E-N. Now, this Latin word, as I mentioned, basically it means name. In the Greco-Roman world, here's what it is, right? How people identified themselves, clans, families, individuals. You had what they called, at least at that time, anyway, the time that's important to us, that is relevant to the letter of Galatians, you had what they called the trianomina. So again, if you speak a little bit Spanish, you will find that, three, okay, nomina, three names, okay? Generally, they had three names to identify an individual, okay? So I'm going to speak of those three names, okay, specifically. So tria nomina, okay, was the three names. That's what it means, literally. So you had the prenomen, you had the nomen gentillicum, and then you had the cognomen. I'm going to start again. The prenomen or praenomen, like again, pardon my Latin pronunciation, Praenomen. You had that. That was the first. In fact, literally, it means first name. This is where we get the word first name from. In French, it's even closer to the Latin prénom, praenomen. Okay? Then you had the second name, or the middle name, what we call a middle name in English. It's the nomen gentillicum. And then finally, you have the cognomen. Now, the cognomen is particular. The cognomen is basically, it was a nickname. Okay? It's, how do I explain it? It's a nickname that an individual had that probably describe a particular characteristic about the individual. So that was the cognomen, or the cognomen, C-O-G-N-O-M-E-N. So you would say that would be the last name, but it's not, it is not directly related to our concept of last name. You will see our concept of last name, I would say, is more, there's more the direct relation to the nomen gentillicum, the middle name. Okay? So let me describe them. Like I said, the praenomen is self-evidently, it means the first name. Okay? The nomen gentillicum, literally, it means Gentile name. Now, Gentile, those of y'all who are familiar with the Bible and church, especially when it comes to Protestant, Pentecostal, be it so-called black or so-called white, you'll hear this term Gentile. And in fact, yes, in the New Testament, you are going to find the term Gentile in English Bibles. So Gentile, again, it stems from, or gentilicum, from which you get the word Gentile. So remember, we're talking about the middle name, okay? And the trianomina, the Greco-Roman trianomina, the middle name, which was called the nomen gentilicum. The Gentilicum comes from the word we just talked about earlier, gens or gentis. Okay, so what it means literally is, like I say, if you want to do a transliteration, is the Gentile name. But what the Gentile name was, it was the name of the clan, the name of the gens, okay, or the gentes. Okay, so every clan had a name. That's why I tell you later on, like in our time now, that name, this is how we get the idea or the concept of last name. Okay. But in the Greco-Roman world of the, when the letter of Galatians was written, by the Apostle Paul, that name was the middle name. Okay. Now the cognomen, they say it was served to supplement the nomen gentilicum, the middle name. So the cognomen is the last name, and I say what it means literally is a nickname, okay? It was used to supplement, okay, the nomen gentilicum, the name of the clan. And this cognomen, or the cognomen, it was, as I mentioned, it's a nickname. They say later on, it would come to demarcate branches of a family tree. Okay, so, as you know, when you have a family tree, so different branches would have different cognomens, but that's a later development. At the time that we're speaking of, the cognomen is simply a nickname, but it's not simply as in saying that it's not important. It's, in fact, it was very important because it was used to supplement, right, to substantiate the middle name, the name of the clan, the nomen gentilicum. Very important, and for our discussion as we move along, the nomen gentilicum is very important for the letter, the names in general, but the nomen gentilicum is going to be very important for the next concept. So, in the last episode, as I mentioned, that I discussed, the Roman society was a society that was structured by different, or consisted of different classes. You had the elite class on top, you had the secondary class under the elite, and you had the third class, which is the plebeians, the people, and then under the common, which the people, meaning the common folks, and then under them you had freedmen, okay? And then under the freedmen you had the slaves. Now, each of these classes, they each had their own particular prestige, culture, and legal rights, but not the way that we understand legal rights today. And this is, you're going to see how this is all going to tie up, okay? We're all going to tie it up by the end of this episode. But if you want a little bit more detail to the specifics of the names, how they were named, watch the previous episode of this series on the letters of Galatia, the letter of Galatia to the Galatians. So these slaves, okay, the slaves can gain certain rights, rights. So a slave in antiquity, in the Greco-Roman world, was similar to almost like the slaves of the transatlantic slave trade in the Americas. You were a property. You were not considered to be a human. You were basically a thing. So obviously, things have no rights. So like a shoe, literally, you were like a shoe or a tool, a hammer. Hammers have no rights. They're just tools that you use for particular purposes. So a slave was the same way in the Greco-Roman world and Greco-Roman society. However, a slave can become human, if you want to say what today we call the notion that we have of human rights. They all stem from some of these ideas here that we're going to discuss. So from being a slave, which is akin to a mere object like a hammer, a shoe, a toothbrush, etc., you could become a human. And you would, by becoming a human, that means a freedman, a freed person. And now, as a freed person, you would gain certain rights, right? So the way that happened, say by virtue of Roman law, the Roman world or the Roman authorities they were people who were very much into law and order, right? The Roman Empire was known for that, right? So they had a system in place, or better yet, to be more precise, there was a process in place set by which someone who is a slave can become a freed person, a freed man or woman. And I'm explaining, I referred to it the last episode. Now we're delving a little bit deeper into it. It's the process of manumission. So manumission, as I said, you had the same thing during this transatlantic slave trade in the United States and the Caribbeans and South America. A slave could, at some point, in the United States, at some point it changed, right? They made it even illegal. You could not become free, but in places like, for example, Haiti and Haitian history, I know this for sure, especially prior to the revolution, the independent revolution that the Haitian enslaved people made, you could become a freed person through the process of manumission, similar to in the Greco-Roman society. Now, manumission as a process of attaining freedom had three ways by which you can attain this freedom. So there were three methods. I'm going to speak about them right now. So there's three methods. The first one was called manumitio vindicta. Manumitio vindicta. The second was sensu. And then the third is testamento. So now I'm going to describe them. The manumitio vindicta, by virtue of Roman law, it was a master can decide or agree with a slave that the slave can attain or gain his or her freedom. So the way that would happen, as I mentioned, is through this process of manumission. And one of the methods is manumitio vindicta. And the manumitio vindicta, the master, along with the slave, would go before a court, right? A court of judges, witnesses, or a magistrate, and would revoke, if you want to say, his or her ownership. Well, more his, because it's a patriarchal society, right, at that time. So the master would revoke his ownership and witness of these elected officials of the slave. And as this, through this method, the slave would now become a freed person. Secondly, through sensu. Sensu, again, if you hear it, sensu. Sensu we get the word census. Okay, so is by the census, as most of y'all will know, is the process or the method of counting people in a society, right? To put it bluntly. So in the Roman world also, you had census where they would count how many citizens, how many people were part of the society. Now, through the census, a master, as the master is entering the enslaved person's name, the master could, in the census, declare or write the enslaved person as free. And through that act, the enslaved person would no longer be a slave and would now be a freed person. Lastly, it's the manumitio testamento, which testamento, as you can hear, this is the word from which we get testament. Now, how that one works is basically the master, I don't know, let's say the master would have promised to his or her slaves that they would be given their freedom upon his death, right? So in order to certify and guarantee this promise, the master would write in his will, testament, then declare that upon his death, enslaved person so and so would acquire freedom. And upon the master's death, indeed, the will would be verified, certified, and that individual would attain their freedom and liberty and would become a freed person, a freed man, or a freed woman. So these are the three methods, of manumission, whereby or through which that an enslaved or slave in the ancient world, the first century particularly, during the time of Paul, etc., and Jesus, they would gain their freedom through this process. And there's three methods. I'll repeat them: manumitio vindicta, sensu, and testamento. Now, as I'm going to wrap up, when a person gained their freedom, remember earlier I talked about those concepts that I talked about: ethno, gens or gentis, and the names, okay? The trianomina. When an individual attained freedom and became a freed person, obviously they're changing status. Now, in the process of manumission, right, or manumitio, whichever method they would use, there's another step, if you want to say, okay, in this process. Sometimes the master and the slave, they would, how do I say this? They would enter into a deal, a new deal. Yes, the master would probably negotiate with the slave. I put my note down. Certain conditions. Okay, say, look, you know what? You're going to gain your freedom. However, I want to become, you're going to hear this word, you're a patron, and I want you to be my client. Okay. Now, this is, again, it doesn't mean exactly what we mean today by client and patron, but there's some kind of correlation. Okay. Does the notion of client that we have today, it's not exactly like someone who's, usually buying from a particular store, so you could be a client of a particular business. It's close, but not exactly, okay, the same. But this is where that notion of client that we have today comes from. So, brief. The master would, in turn, different deal with the slave. Okay, as the slave would gain his or her freedom, the master can require that the slave become his client. Well, what was that? Okay, this new deal. So the patron is basically, it's kind of similar to how we understand it today. So the master would be, because look, remember in that society, right? It's all about, well, not all, but prestige and who mattered a lot. Just like today, but very much so in that society and in antiquity. Therefore, remember, you're changing status. It's basically, see it this way, and this language is also used in the New Testament, in the Bible, right? It's from a slave, it's almost like you're being born again, right? Or you being born again in the sense of, you remember you were a slave, and remember what I told you, a slave was an object. You were not considered a human, a person, right? So when you become a freed man, a freed person, you could say you're being born again. Now, the patron, so being born again, you're introduced into society. Now you're gaining certain rights. But in the society, the people, the freed people, when I say not just when I freed people, the citizens, okay? The citizens by virtue of birth, Roman citizens, for example, or even freed men who became Roman citizens, they would have to recognize you. But because of, the prejudices, okay, of that culture, well, from a slave, you become a freed person. It is not that easy. So you need someone to mediate, if you want to say, between yourself, the new identity that you've acquired of a freed person, and the rest of the normative or society, right? The citizens, right? And so this is in that sense that the master can require that, look, slave so-and-so, slave X, I'm going to give you your freedom on the account that you will allow me to become your patron and you become my client. And then, excuse me, this deal would have certain conditions and certain stipulations. Now, and responsibilities on both sides. The patron would have to guarantee to the client, who was a former slave, that he would, without a doubt, represent he or she in, proper society and would make room for their progress. And if you want to say, even to a certain extent, I don't want to say guarantee, but facilitate their societal mobility. For me, not to say upward mobility per se, because that's not guaranteed, but definitely the patron, the client would require that the patron uses his influence and power to guarantee certain ease through this new world that this new individual, this freed person, is now entering. And in return, the patron, the former master, can, for example, ask that the client contribute financially to his clan, family, or he could also require that the former slave, which is now the client, to join his clan, and when he's going to war, to battle, or even, and also, by the way, the client could also ask that the patron, they both to a certain extent can require these conditions, like, represent each other in some form or capacity before the law. So this, you get what I'm saying? So this was some of the, if you want to say, the deals that can happen through the process of manumission, which is the process by which an enslaved or slave person and that world would gain their freedom and therefore become known as a person and gain rights. So these concepts here that I just explained to y'all, they're going to be very important to have in mind when you're reading the letter to the Galatians, because Paul is going to allude to or even explicitly refer to some of these concepts, these societal and cultural ideas. Okay, so the more you understand and you keep those in mind as you're reading the text, especially as I go along as your guide, I'm going to point out to you what words in your English or French translations that represent some of these concepts and ideas that I'm talking about. And then you'll see the letter, the text, through a different dimension. Okay, you'll see that it's not that, like I said again, yes, you can read those texts through different lenses. Okay, however, I believe that for me anyway, and my training, and also I sense that it is better to first try, right, to have an accurate depiction of the world of a text, such, when you talk about historical texts such as the letters in the New Testament, right, to get an accurate representation of the world from which these texts come from before you try to interpret them for, to gain meaning for yourself. If that makes sense. Now, if it doesn't make sense to you, you can always leave a comment. And don't forget for this podcast to subscribe, like, even dislike, and share if you appreciate what I've been doing. So obviously, I'm coming to the end of this episode, but we're going to talk about more concepts in the next episode, and as we move along towards reading some of the chapters in the text and the letter, because I'm not going to be able to read all the chapters, and it's a very long letter, but at least I'll read with you after we've gone through this preliminary, process of understanding the social, cultural, philosophical context for the letter, and we're going to try to read, some chapters, and so we can try to get, some understanding from that letter. So today, remember, we talked about the idea of ethnicity or ethnos and ethne, gens, gentes, which represent a clan. We talked about, excuse me, the notion of the trianomina, okay, which is the three names that individuals in Roman society had. We talked about the concept of manumission, or just finished talking about it, which is the process by which a slave person gained their freedom. And you see, all this relates because, lastly, let me add something, okay, to this notion of, patron and client. When the slave person became a freed person, and say the master, the former master, entered into this new deal with the freed person, into this deal of patron and client, the client, okay, one privilege, okay, the client, the patron may promise or even give the client his nomen gentilicum. Remember the second name, the middle name, the Gentile name. So it's basically, remember I talked about, it's almost like, well, from a slave, you're being born again, or you're being born anew. Because once you were an object in society, right? Even though, yes, we see, as far as from our modern eyes, oh yeah, this is a human. But in that world, it's like, human, no, this is a thing. And you're an object. Now you become a free person. You're entering into humanity, and you need to be identified. Okay, so the master, who becomes now the former slave person, the freedman's patron, can allow him or enter him or her into his clan, into his family. Okay, so hence the client, the former enslaved person who is now a freed person, would take on the nomen gentilicum, the Gentile name, the name of the clan. So say the first name was Xavier. As a slave, you were just known as Xavier. Okay. Now you would become known as Xavier. Say the clan name, was Baptiste, Jean-Baptiste, Xavier Jean-Baptiste. And then you'd have the cognomen, which is the nickname. The nickname would be something that would represent or supplement the name of the clan. It would probably call you, I don't know, something that symbolizes or that implies that you a little member, like say, a little one from Jean-Baptiste clan, right? If that makes sense to you. So you would be Xavier Jean-Baptiste, or Xavier, little one of the Jean-Baptiste clan. That would be your full name. So you see, I hope I did justice here to see how all these concepts now, I've tied them together. How these, and also with to make the clan, right? Now, even though, say, you could have been a slave you could have been a former barbarian, because remember, to the Romans, every other nationality or nation or groups of people, actually not every other, most were barbarians. So you could have been a barbarian from, I don't know, say North Africa, for example, or a barbarian from the Caucasus Mountain. As a slave, you come from you had a different ethnicity. Now that you're a freed person and you enter into this deal of patron and client relationship with your former master, you would now be adopted. Very important. This concept of adoption also is in the letter. You'd be adopted into the clan, and through adoption, now you would also attain the ethnic identity of your patron's clan. So this is how we end this episode. Remember, I'm Gandhi. Again, I ask y'all to share, comment, engage with me. If you get anything from these episodes, if you have any questions, if you have any disagreement, or if you have any things that you would like to bring clarity speak some clarity about, because maybe you're better versed than me in this subject. Who knows? It's not impossible. In any case, engage, share, like, subscribe. I am Gandhi, and this was the OG's Perspective podcast. This was the second segment of the episode on the letter of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament to the Galatians. So I'll see y'all on the next episode. Peace.